Hey, good morning. It is good to see you guys this morning. I was thinking about something last night, and I want to see if this is, maybe if you identify with this. Have you ever come across things in life that when you first hear about them, you just hear the name, like what it's called, it sounds amazing, and then later you find out what it actually is, and you're like, oh, like it's a huge letdown? I remember when I was a little kid, my parents told me that we were going to a restaurant, and at this restaurant they had a soda fountain, and I was like, that sounds amazing. I'm picturing like a fountain like you would have out in front of somebody's house that's like spewing water everywhere, except with soda. And I'm like, can I swim in it? Like, it sounded like the most amazing thing ever. And we got there, and they showed me like where you take your cup up to like choose which drink, and I was like, this is lame. Like, I just thought it was the dumbest thing ever. It was such a letdown. Now, I love soda fountains, but the expectations from what the name was to what it actually was like, it did not match up at all. And that happens in lots of things in life. How awesome does this sound? Garnished wages? Like, I get my wages plus a little extra on the side? Are you serious? And then you find out it's actually the opposite. And it's like, oh, that's not cool at all. Or maybe there's other, have you ever heard of a fire drill? How awesome does that sound? Fire drill? Seriously? That's the coolest tool ever until you sit through a fire drill. And then you're like, this is the worst. I hate this. Laser eye surgery? Like, you're going to make me a superhero? Like, that's what you're telling me? Laser eye surgery? Sounds awesome. Not that awesome. Like, there's just things in life that they sound way cooler than they actually are. But then there's other things in life that we know what it is, and we should know that it's not going to like measure up to our expectations for it, but we can't help it anyways. Things like microwave popcorn, like smells amazing, and we all know what it is. We go eat it, and it never tastes as good as it smells. Like, it just doesn't. It's a bit of a letdown. Or maybe if you've ever had all-you-can-eat prime rib and crab legs, sounds awesome, but any place offering all-you-can-eat prime rib and crab legs, I promise you the quality, not great. And you're going to go, and you're going to be expecting this, and you're going to, and yeah, like there's just things like that. But there's also something in life that we all want, and we know exactly what it is, but we still want it. And we know that this thing, that if we get it, it can be incredibly destructive to our lives if we have too much of it. Like, it could really cause some problems for us, but it just doesn't change the fact of, I want this thing. And I'm not talking about bacon, I'm talking about autonomy. We love autonomy. We all love the idea of being able to make whatever decisions in life. That we want to make all of our own decisions. We love the idea of being self-governed. I want to be able to do what I want, when I want, and I want to have the money to pay for it. Like, that is our mindset. It sounds amazing. But the thing that we know is this, is that our drive for autonomy, it tends to be fueled in life by a few different things. Sometimes our drive for autonomy is fueled by the fact that most of our heroes appear to be autonomous. Like, most of the people you look up to in life, part of the reason you look up to them is because it seems like they're in control of their own destiny. Like, they get to, what they decide for themselves is what ends up happening. And we admire that. We lift that up. And so we look to that. Another thing that fuels this drive for autonomy that we all have is maybe the way you were raised. Maybe you grew up in financial hardship, and you grew up in a difficult situation, or maybe you grew up in a situation where maybe you had to live with relatives for a while, or maybe you grew up on welfare, you grew up on food stamps, or you grew up in a situation where you were constantly having to justify your needs to a social worker, and it just made you feel less than, and you made a promise to yourself that you will never let your family experience that. That you are going to be self-sufficient, you're going to take care of your own needs. I'm never going to have to depend on people for these things. So maybe experiences that you've had in life have fueled that drive for autonomy. Or maybe it's just this general sense that we all have of, I can handle it. That if I'm the one making the decisions, I'll make all the right decisions. Like, if other people would just let me do my thing, everything would go just fine. See, the hard thing about this drive for autonomy is that we would all agree a little bit of autonomy is a good thing. Like, on a certain level, we want to, and we encourage people to be able to make their own decisions. You want a certain level of autonomy for your kids. As a matter of fact, if your kids are little, you're probably dreaming of the day when they have a little bit more autonomy, when they're able to do a little bit more for themselves. But like most things in life, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So you look at it this way, our quest for autonomy is also, it's dangerous, because essentially it's a quest for power. That autonomy is power. The more and more autonomy you have, the more and more ability you have to make your own decisions, the more you want. And power, we know this, power is intoxicating, and intoxicated people don't make very good decisions. They don't listen, and before long they're surrounded by people who don't have really anything to say. Pretty soon there's nobody around them that have the courage to say, I don't know if you want to do that, or maybe you should rethink this, or maybe try a different approach. And then success makes it worse, right? Like that exacerbates it. It makes us think, oh, look how awesome I'm doing. I must be great at this. And before long, everybody around you is either getting a paycheck or they're related to you. And they're in a position where their honesty would cost them. See, when you find yourself in that situation where no one around you can tell you no without losing somebody, it's actually going to end up costing you. And it's going to cost the people that you care most. It's going to cost everyone. We've been going through the book of Daniel, and this is actually week 8 of going through the book of Daniel. So if this is your first time here and you're catching this sermon, this is actually the last sermon in this series on Daniel. And so you are coming in at the tail end of one of maybe the most difficult to understand books in the Bible, and one of the most hotly debated within Christianity. Like there's lots of people that have different opinions about sections of the book of Daniel. And so realize that if this is your first time here today, that's what you're stepping into. You're coming in on the tail end of a conversation that included a whole lot of things. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, go online and check out the previous weeks of this series. Like I said, this is week 8. We're going to be finishing up the series today. And we've been talking throughout this series about the book of Daniel is all about living, how to live differently in the midst of a culture that's opposed to God. And we see this over and over throughout the first half of the book. The main character, Daniel, we see him living in a situation where he's living amongst a culture that's not his. It's completely opposed to everything that he grew up knowing and understanding. And in the midst of that, he's got to figure out how to live a life faithful to God with all of these outside pressures all around him. And so all throughout the first half of the book, you see story after story of these kings that Daniel has to work for, and these kings who had achieved what many would assume to be the pinnacle of autonomy. They're in a position where whatever they say goes. They're basically in the position of God, where anything they want, they get. All they have to do is say the word. And for king after king after king that Daniel serves, we see that only Daniel and his friends are people, they're the only ones who are willing to say no to these kings. And sometimes they say no because the kings are doing the wrong things. And sometimes they say no to the kings because the kings are asking them to do the wrong things. But regardless, none of the kings really listen well. And it results over and over in one validation of Daniel's faithfulness, like a validation saying, look, this is a good thing that you're continuing to remain faithful to God. And sometimes, often, it ends in disaster, some type of disaster for the king who wouldn't listen, who was all caught up in their own autonomy. And so the first half of the book, those stories, sets up the second half of the book. And if you remember, when we hit Daniel chapter 7, the book takes a big shift. So Daniel's getting old at this point. He's been serving in Babylon for upwards of 50 years. And as he gets older, Daniel begins to question, and there's obvious question comes to mind, is like, is there any hope? Daniel's been living this way for 50 years, and he's been faithful, but he's still in exile, and he's still getting older. And so he asks God, okay, how long is it going to be this way? And the answer he gets isn't good. He gets a series of visions, and that's the second half of the book of Daniel. In chapter 7, if you remember several weeks ago when we looked at chapter 7, it gave this vision of Babylon and kingdoms of this world, various human kingdoms that would come before and after Babylon, were portrayed as these violent beasts who crush the innocent and oppress those that they rule over. And they do that because they have exalted their nation and they've exalted their empire to the place of God. And so you see that in Daniel chapter 7 really vividly with some pretty crazy imagery described there. And then you get to Daniel chapter 9, and Daniel's asking God, okay, how long is this going to go on? And God tells him, look, Israel's sin, the whole reason you guys are living in exile, that sin runs a whole lot deeper than you realize. And that rescue out of that exile isn't coming nearly as quickly as Daniel had hoped. And that this scenario of these kingdoms, these violent, beastly human kingdoms coming to power and dominating over others is going to continue. And it's going to play out over and over and over. And as we get ready to close out the book of Daniel today, we're going to be looking at the final vision that Daniel is given. And we're almost done with the book, and we're still asking the same question we've been asking through the whole thing. What hope is there? Like, why should Daniel get up every morning and still remain faithful to God? What has it gotten him so far? Like, yes, God has saved him in some situations, but ultimately, he's still in exile. And he's just gotten the message saying, that's not going to end. He actually tells him, like, you're going to die in exile. And so, like, what is the reason for Daniel to get up every morning and continue to live his life faithfully to God? Why should he resist both giving his allegiance to a beastly nation or empire, and why should he also resist pursuing total autonomy at the risk of becoming a beast himself? With everything that he's been through, why should he remain faithful when he has continually seen and been told by God that this is the reality of the world and it is not changing anytime soon? And maybe you've been asking the same question. As you looked at our world and you looked at the things going on in our world and you're going, okay, God, how long? And as it's gone on, maybe throughout your life, you've been able to look back over decades and see that it doesn't seem to ever really change. Like maybe sometimes are better than others and other times are worse than others, but generally we see the same pattern happening over and over and over. And so the question for us, each of us, becomes, okay, God, how long? And the answer seems to be, look, it's just going to continue. That's the pattern. This is the way the world works. And so we're asking that question, how long, God, as we get to, where's the hope in this as we get to Daniel chapter 10? And so that's where we're going to be today. We're actually going to look at chapters 10 through 12. It's a really long vision. It's a really detailed vision, so we're not going to read through the entire thing. But if you've got a Bible, go ahead and open it up, turn it on, do whatever you need to do to get there. Daniel chapter 10 is where we're going to start. And this is where it gets what it says. We'll jump right in verse 1. It says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who was called Belteshazzar. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the vision came to him, the understanding of the message came to him in a vision. Verse 2, at that time I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotion at all until the 3 weeks were over. So Daniel, this is serious. Like, he is seriously depressed there. Like, we're talking about, like, he's not eating food, but apparently the crowning mark of this severe depression is he won't use lotion. Like, a failure to moisturize is like, this is, things are bad. And so there's Daniel, and think about this. Like, this means that this vision that he's been given, it just wrecks him. He has a vision of a man who's shining brilliantly, looks like an angel. And that angel begins to tell him something. And we'll pick that up in verse 7. I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. Those who were with me did not see it, but such terror overwhelmed them that they fled and hid themselves. So I was alone gazing at this great vision. I had no strength left. My face turned deathly pale, and I was helpless. Then I heard him speaking, and as I listened to him, I fell into a deep sleep, my face to the ground. Like, this sounds pretty horrible. It sounds pretty intense. This angelic figure begins to reveal the future of what is going to happen to Daniel and to his people that have remained faithful to God in the midst of this culture that's opposed to him. And so over the course of the next several chapters, this angel begins to lay out the future. Like, here's what's going to happen to all of you. Okay, Daniel, you've been asking how long. Well, here's how it's going to play out. Now, if you're a history buff, you are going to love the next little bit that we talk about. If you are not a history buff, you are going to probably think this is pretty boring. Because like, if history was not your thing in school, you're going to be like, oh. But if you were into history, you're going to find this really interesting. But we have to look at this quickly to kind of give you an idea of what is going on. So here it is. What happens here, Daniel chapter 11, is mostly the foretelling of ancient Near Eastern political and military activity of what's going to happen over the next several hundred years from the time Daniel is given this vision. So for Daniel, it's a foretelling. It's telling the future. But for us, we've been able to look back through history and realize that most of it is actually, for us, it's kind of a retelling. That we look back on it because these talk about events that have already happened. And actually, it gives some very, very specific details. So we'll look at that. Daniel chapter 11, we're in verse 2. This is what it says. The angel is describing to Daniel what happens. It says, "Now then, I tell you the truth. 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will arise who will rule with great power and do as he pleases." So basically, the description that the angel is giving here is basically describing essentially the same vision that Daniel has received a couple of times already in the book. It's describing the vision of the statues that we talked about in chapter 2, and it's describing the vision of the beasts that we talked about in chapter 7. It's basically a look at these human kingdoms that are going to arise, these human empires that are going to come to power. And they're going to come to power one after another, and they're all basically going to do the same thing. They're going to elevate their nation to a godlike status. They're going to redefine what is good and evil, and they're going to rule through violence. And so Babylon, the nation that was in power when Daniel was first taken into exile, they're not the first, and they're not going to be the last either. It mentioned in verse 2 that there were 3 Persian kings. If we went back in history, we could name those kings specifically. I just can't pronounce their names, so I'm not going to. But when you get to that 4th king, it says there's a 4th king who is richer than all the others. You may be familiar with this king. This is King Xerxes. King Xerxes was the king of the Persian Empire at the very end. If you've read the book of Esther or you've seen the movie 300, you're familiar with King Xerxes. And so King Xerxes comes to power in Persia, and he stirs up the Persian Empire against the Greek Empire. In verse 3, it talks about a mighty king who arises, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. This is talking about a Greek king who wields incredible power. This is talking about Alexander the Great. That we know from outside historical sources, we know that Alexander the Great rose to power and he established the Greek Empire through this amazing military campaign, the most fantastic, huge military campaign in the history of the world up to this point. Alexander the Great basically pushes west from Greece all the way almost to India and expands the boundaries of the Greek Empire that far. But it says in the verse that... Verse 4, after he has arisen, talking about Alexander the Great, after he has arisen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. This is what the angel is predicting before it ever happens, and we know historically that's exactly what happens. Pretty much as soon as Alexander expands the empire and gets all of this power, he gets sick and he dies, and he never actually gets to rule. And so his kingdom gets parceled out to different rulers. And so that happens. And when that happens, there's a couple of the 4 rulers that kind of take on sections of the empire. There's a couple that begin to argue and that begin to basically struggle for power over the region of Israel. And so you see this in history. This isn't only a Bible thing. We see this in secular historical documentation that we've discovered, that we know that this war was going on between a kingdom in the south, which we know was Egypt, and a kingdom in the north that we know was Syria. And so for the next 30 verses or so in chapter 11, it gives incredible detail of what for Daniel, what would happen, but for us, we're able to look back and see what did happen. And it gives incredible detail. If you read through those verses, it's actually a pretty interesting story of there's some pretty intense political maneuvering that's going on. There's some sex scandals that goes on. It's some really crazy stuff. There's broken alliances. And we know that all this happened, not just from the Bible, but from external historical sources. But as the description goes on, you get through those 30 verses, as the description goes on, you begin to see a caricature arise, that this one person, the king of the north, begins to be portrayed as like an uber bad guy. Like we've talked about rulers coming to power and that they become these hideous beasts. This king of the north becomes like the worst of the worst. He becomes absolutely terrible. And in Daniel chapter 11, verse 31 and 32, it describes what this king of the north does when he comes to power. It says his armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. See, basically, it's saying that the king of this king of the north is going to attack Jerusalem, and he's going to take over the temple. And we don't know that this isn't just a foreshadowing of what would happen, but for us, we look back on it as a historical event that actually did happen. This happened in about the 160s BC. You can read about it in the books called 1st and 2nd Maccabees. See, it tells a story of this Syrian king named Antiochus, who comes to power, and basically what he does is he makes it illegal to be a Jew, a practicing Jew, in the city of Jerusalem. And he takes over the temple. And what he does is he institutes a law that says anyone caught reading the Torah or observing traditional Jewish practices is going to be sent to prison. And then this abomination that causes desolation, what that's referring to is something that Antiochus did. He set up this massive idol to Zeus in the temple of the Hebrew God. And he set it up there and he rededicates the temple not to Yahweh but to Zeus. And then the worst thing that he does is once he sets up that idol in the temple, every single day he would choose one Jewish person and he would bring them into the temple and he would force them to bow down to this and worship this idol. And if they didn't do it, he would publicly mutilate and torture them as a message to the rest of the Jews that they better fall in line. Pretty terrible guy. And so the scripture is telling us about this. The angel is telling Daniel about these events that are going to happen, but for us, we know that they already have. And he goes on and describes them a little more. And look at this description in verse 36. It says, the king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful till the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. It says he does as he pleases. Basically, he is the embodiment of all that is evil and wrong with the beastly human kingdoms and their rulers that are seen. And it's all embodied in this guy, Antiochus. Maybe if I told you his full name, that would give you more of a clue. He's actually referred to as Antiochus Epiphanes. But Epiphanes is not his last name. It's actually a Greek title that he gave to himself. And the Greek word Epiphanes literally means God manifest. Like Antiochus, his defining characteristic is autonomy. It is I make the decisions, what I say goes. And when his autonomy is fully realized, he demands a level of allegiance from God's people that was never meant to be his. And all of the visions of the book of Daniel are aligned to be pointing to this moment, that Antiochus is viewed as the new Babylon. And this is why the book of Daniel was so popular amongst Jewish people during the time of Antiochus, because you read the stories of Daniel and his resistance to the nation and to the empire, and it inspires hope. and inspires hope that if we can just resist, that God will come in and make everything right. But if it's all that this book had been building to, then why do we still read it? And Antiochus is long dead and gone. Why would it still be important to us today? Well, the reason is because towards the end of chapter 11, it becomes clear that the angel who is explaining this vision, he's not only talking about Antiochus. He goes on to describe this king of the north doing things throughout history that we know Antiochus actually didn't ever do. And so the readers, after the time of Antiochus, they see this and they know that there's more going on there. That it isn't only about what will happen, but it's about what happens. This angel and God, in sending this message to Daniel, he's not describing what is going to happen. He's describing this pattern that we've seen throughout Daniel, that this is what happens when people pursue their own autonomy. This is what happens when that becomes the chief thing, and this is what happens when we allow beastly empires and rulers and nations to rise up and to do what they think is right without any nod or acknowledgement of God at all. This is what happens. And Daniel saw this too. He's been seeing it. He's been experiencing it his entire life in Babylon. And he knows that this is just the beginning. That Babylon was not the first empire to rise up like this, and it's not going to be the last. And so this deeply disturbs Daniel, because it appears that things are never going to get better. It appears that humans are just doomed to repeat this over and over and over, and kingdom after kingdom is going to be built on this sense of autonomy that leads to the demand for allegiance that should only be given to God, who's the creator and who is truly sovereign over all. But then, at that darkest moment, when the message is the worst, the angel who is explaining this all to Daniel finally offers some hope. It says that, yes, that pattern is going to continue, but it's going to end. Chapter 12, verse 1. The angel tells him, it says, "There will be a time of distress such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered." He's saying, look, rescue is coming. These beastly human kingdoms, they are going to fall. That there will be a last one eventually. And that at that time, those who have been faithful, who have kept their faithfulness to God, they will be delivered. And he goes on, verse 2, it says, "Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt." When it talks about being asleep in the dust, that's a Jewish way of talking about death. And so when it says to come awake, that those who are sleeping in the dust come awake, it's talking about resurrection. And so what the angel is describing here is that those who have pursued their autonomy apart from God, that they are going to awake to everlasting contempt. That they will be resurrected to everlasting shame and contempt. But verse 3, chapter 12, verse 3, "Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." See, the faithful are raised to everlasting life with God. And for Daniel, he's hearing this, and it's got to be so confusing to him, because the natural question is, okay, it doesn't look like you're going to set everything right, but yet you say you're going to set everything right. So, okay, when? Because this is rough. Like, this has been hard to live through this, to push through this. He gets his answer. So he asked that question in verse 8. He says, "I heard, but I did not understand. So I asked, 'My Lord, what will the outcome of all this be?'" And he gets an answer in verse 10. Kind of, not really, kind of. Verse 10, "Many will be purified, made spotless and refined." This is the angel speaking to him. "But the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand." And he basically says, look, it's going to be a while. It's going to be a long time. This is like a total non-answer. Like, Daniel has asked a very specific question, and he does not get a clear answer. This is like when my kids and I, like, we're on a road trip, and it's a long road trip, and they're sitting in the back bugging, like, "Hey, when are we going to be there? When are we going to be there?" I have a standard response. I always say the same thing: 10 hours. When are we going to be there? 10 hours. Because the thing is this: I know that if I tell them when we're going to get there, it doesn't change anything. It doesn't make time go faster, and it's not even going to stop their questions because they're going to continue asking, are we there yet? Are we there? How much farther? And I know for them that answer is really frustrating. Like, that's kind of why I do it. It's kind of fun, I got to be honest. But I know it's frustrating because when you have a genuine question and somebody just kind of blows you off like that, it's not fun, and it's frustrating to deal with because we want to know. But I want to ask you this. Would it really be helpful to know? Like if we were asking this question that Daniel's asking, if we're asking it of God, okay, God, how long is this going to take? When are you going to take care of things? Would it really be helpful to know? See, when I think about that, I think that my opinion is that I think knowing would simply play into our drive for autonomy. Here's what I mean. When I was a kid, sometimes my parents, they would spend most of the day out running errands. It didn't happen often, but every once in a while, they'd just have stuff they have to go do. And so they would leave me at home with my sister. My sister's 5 years older than me. She would be the babysitter, and they'd leave us at home. Almost every time they did this, they would give us some chores. And they would say, by the time we get home, X, Y, and Z, these things need to be done. And then they would leave for the day, but we didn't necessarily know when they were coming home. And so anytime that happened, we would always put off our responsibilities in pursuit of our own autonomy. We're going to play games, we're going to get into fights, we're going to make messes. We're going to do anything but our chores. We're going to do anything but what we've been asked to do. But as soon as we had the slightest indication that they might be home soon, maybe that's a phone call, maybe that's the sound of the tires on the gravel driveway, it was a mad rush to get all the chores done. Like, hey, we got to clean the house, we got to get it all put away, we're stuffing stuff under beds, shoving it into closets, anything we could do to get it out of sight. We just wanted to get it done, and it never worked. Like every time my parents would come home and maybe they'd look around at first and be like, oh yeah, you did it. But then they'd open the closet and stuff would fall out, or they'd look under the bed. And they always knew when it was a rush job. They always knew when we were doing it just to check the box. We weren't actually trying to do what they asked us to do. We were just trying to make it look good. See, what I realize now is that my parents weren't simply focused on getting chores done. That by leaving us stuff to do, they were shaping our character. And they were building a relationship of trust. I could trust that they would come home. And my faithfulness in demonstrating my trust of that, it showed them it demonstrated that I believed their return mattered. And that ultimately, it would bring me good. Sometimes they'd bring me candy. Sometimes they'd bring me a toy. But mostly, it brought a reward of relationship. And every time I had a sense of when that would happen, when they would be home, man, I pursued my autonomy. I did whatever I wanted, and then I tried to clean it up at the end, and it always got busted. They could always tell it was a rush job. They knew when I had prioritized my relationship with them and when I had simply tried to check boxes in order to appease them. See, I'm of the opinion that if we knew when God was going to make it all right, when he was going to fix it all, we would do what we wanted to until the very last minute. And then we'd try to clean it all up at the last second. And there would be no doubt that we had neglected our relationship in favor of getting what we want. We'd be trying to have our cake and eat it too. See, God not telling us when gives us the best opportunity to pursue a real relationship with him rather than just placing our hope in what we can do on our own. Our hope is not in what we can do or what we have done, but in who we have believed. The very last verse of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 13. This is God's last words to Daniel. This is what he says. As for you, go your way till the end. You will rest. Then at the end of days, you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. He says, go your way till the end. Stay faithful because you know that we will get there. As frustrating as it may seem at times, this is the most comforting non-answer ever given to a question. He doesn't answer his question. He doesn't tell him this is when it's going to happen. He just says basically, hey, you can trust me. Keep doing what you know is right. Keep doing what you know is necessary to maintain a relationship with me. Stay faithful to that, and I promise you it will be good. You will rest, which means he's going to die. And then at the end of days, you will rise. We don't have to know when, because we trust who. The promise of Christ is better than the pattern of the world. The promise of Christ is better than the pattern of the world. See, our pattern is to pursue autonomy and to give allegiance to things that do not deserve it. And when we come to God and we say, God, how long? He doesn't give us a solid answer. And that is the most comforting thing if you're a believer of Jesus. And the reason it's comforting, it only comes if you're able to grasp this main theme of the book of Daniel, the idea that God's in charge of who's in charge. If you can trust that God's in charge of who's in charge, then it doesn't matter what is coming, and it doesn't matter what's going to happen. If you can trust that the promise is better than the pattern, we can trust and we can have confidence that the resurrection promised by Jesus is coming and that it will happen. We trust the hope that a relationship with God brings to our lives. And that hope, in turn, motivates our faithfulness so that we can live different lives. I want to end with just a peek at what that resurrection is. That resurrection that Daniel speaks of, that the angel communicates to Daniel, says, hang on because this is coming. This is what he's talking about. It's pictured in Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 through 4. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things have passed. The old order, that pattern, is gone. Then in verse 22, beginning in verse 3, it says this, no longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. Listen to this. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. There will be no more night. They will not need the light or a lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. It is hard to live a life faithful to God in the midst of a culture that at every turn seems to be opposed to him and is pulling us to go along with the current of the culture rather than staying planted, remaining faithful to our relationship with God. But I can promise you that faithfulness is worth it. And it is worth it because the promise of Christ is better than the pattern of the world. And we can trust that because we know that God is in charge of who is in charge. So maybe you're here this morning and maybe for the first time you're saying, you know what, I need to have that hope. That I've been watching the things going on in the world and it gets so depressing and it gets so difficult and I can't imagine what it would be like to have to face all of these things. Like, we see all of that going on. And to have that peace, to know that through it all, God's in control. And that he is going to bring about restoration, that he is going to set it all right. I don't know how you get through this life without that. I don't know how you look at what goes on in the world and the pain and the suffering that we see every single day. I don't know how you get through that. Because even if we were to take a path where, okay, I'm just going to look after me, and I'm going to pursue my own autonomy, and I'm going to make as many decisions for myself as I can, we see over and over throughout the book of Daniel and throughout history, it doesn't work. So if you're here this morning and you want to place that faith in God, maybe for the first time, I would love to talk with you. We're going to sing a song this morning. We're going to sing about God changing us from the inside out. That God, I don't want to rely on my external activities. It's not about what I can do for you. It's about you changing me from the inside out because of that hope that I have in you to be who you said you would be and to do what you said you would do. As we sing that, I would love to hear your story. Come back and talk to me. I'll be standing in the back of the room. I'd love to talk with you, to pray with you, to talk about what is a life with Jesus, what do those next steps look like. Or maybe that's something that you've had before. That there was a time in your life where you were walking with God, or you were trying to maybe learn more about Him, and over time, you looked at the things going on in the world, maybe in your life or maybe in the world in general, and you said, I don't think this is ever going to happen. Like you're seeing that pattern roll over and over and over, and somehow you got it in your mind that pattern is going to be more powerful than the promise. And maybe today is the day you realize, no, I need to place my faith back in that promise that God has for us, to place my faith back in His character and His trustworthiness to bring about what He said. I would love to talk with you. I'd love to pray with you. It is worth it. The promise of Christ is always better than the pattern of the world. Let's pray together. Father, we love you. We thank you so much for Jesus. Thank you for your grace, for your power, for your strength to overcome the curse of sin and death, that we can look at the world and we can see the path that we have laid out for ourselves and that we see repeated over and over and over throughout history and within our culture today, and we can see where that leads. God, help us not to settle for that there is so much more than this life, that there is an eternal life waiting for us with you, and that if we will place our faith in you and remain faithful to the end, that God, we will experience that. So give us strength, give us courage, give us endurance to press through. God, we're counting on you. We trust you. You said this would happen. We believe you. Thank you. In Jesus' name we pray.